Imagine for a moment, you don't have the certainty of seeing a new dawn, of the sun warming your skin again. Every breath is a tiny miracle, an ephemeral victory in the grand lottery of existence. Just being born was a stroke of luck. But living beyond a few years, my dear friends, was a true feat, a mockery of fate. In the Middle Ages, life was a fragile thread, constantly threatened. It wasn't just disease, that invisible shadow hanging over every village, every castle, every hut. It was also hunger, a recurring ghost that decimated entire populations. Bloody and ruthless wars ravaged fields and lives indiscriminately, not to mention accidents, lack of hygiene, wounds that today would seem insignificant, but were then death sentences. Everything conspired in a macabre dance, so that medieval men rarely lived beyond 30 years. 30 years. Think about it. So many were left behind that each day was a battle. The next plague, the next famine, the next infected wound always lurked. Living was a constant risk, a perpetual challenge. And it is in this scenario of precariousness, of lives hanging by a thread, that we will see why medieval people lived so little. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. I'm Silent of History, and my goal is for this story to immerse you in a unique experience while you fall into a good sleep. Imagine a world where the cradle wasn't a symbol of hope, but all too often, a waiting room for the tomb. If medieval life was a lottery, childhood was the most brutal round. A true hell where the odds were catastrophically stacked against the little ones. The estimates are chilling. It is believed that between 30 and 50% of children did not live to see their first birthday. And if you were lucky enough to overcome that first barrier, the path was no less arduous. It is estimated that between 50 and 60% did not reach the age of 5. That means that in every home, in every family, the shadow of child death was a constant companion, a recurrent and heartbreaking visit. It wasn't an exceptional tragedy. It was the norm, an intrinsic part of existence. The main cause of this silent massacre was infectious diseases. For us, in the modern era, with access to vaccines and antibiotics, it's hard to conceive of the terror instilled by ailments like smallpox, measles, or whooping cough. These weren't benign childhood diseases. They were death sentences. Diarrhea and dysentery, the result of desperately contaminated water and food supplies, were true child killers. A simple cold could lead to fatal pneumonia, a small cut to a fulminant infection. Think about it. Children's immune systems are, by nature, more vulnerable. In the Middle Ages, that vulnerability was magnified exponentially. There was no concept of viruses or bacteria. Diseases were seen as divine punishments, bad humors, miasmas in the air, or internal imbalances. How do you fight an enemy you don't even know exists? Remedies were often ineffective, sometimes even harmful, based on superstitions, herbs whose real effect was minimal, or bleedings that only further weakened the small patient. This bleak picture was exacerbated by the almost complete lack of understanding of hygiene and germs. Cities and villages were breeding grounds for infection. Human and animal waste accumulated in the streets. Rivers were both a source of drinking water and dumping grounds. Hand washing was an uncommon practice, and personal cleanliness was far from current standards. Clothes were rarely thoroughly washed, and lice and fleas were inseparable companions. Imagine a child playing in a puddle of stagnant water that also serves as a drain, or drinking from a well where animals drink and defecate. Every interaction with the environment was a roulette wheel of pathogens. There were no sewage systems or clean running water in most homes. Knowledge of sanitation was rudimentary at best. Mothers, no matter how well-intentioned, didn't know that by washing clothes in the same river where they later collected water to drink, they were, unknowingly, incubating disease in their own homes. This ignorance wasn't negligence. It was a limitation of the knowledge of the time, but its consequences for child life were devastating. If diseases weren't enough, hunger and malnutrition were the other great executioners. Mothers, often poorly nourished during pregnancy and lactation, couldn't provide adequate nutrients to their babies. Breastfeeding, vital for immune system development, could be a challenge in times of scarcity. And when solid foods were introduced, they were often inadequate for a baby's delicate digestive system. Porridges with little nutritional value or contaminated foods that generated more gastrointestinal diseases. A bad harvest could mean the difference between life and death for a child. Famines were cyclical in many regions, and the youngest and weakest were always the first to fall. A malnourished child has a compromised immune system, unable to fight off the slightest infection, falling into a vicious circle of illness and weakness. Malnutrition didn't just kill directly. It made children easy prey for any other ailment. The very act of birth was an extreme danger. Difficult births, without professional medical assistance or the advance of modern obstetrics, posed an enormous risk to both mother and baby. Postpartum infections were common and lethal. A baby born with any complication or respiratory difficulty had very little chance of survival. Maternal mortality was extremely high, and if the mother died, the newborn's chances of survival drastically decreased. There were no incubators or neonatal care. A premature or weak baby in the Middle Ages had almost no future, and for those who survived birth and the first few months, domestic accidents lurked. In rudimentary homes, often with open fires for cooking and heating, agricultural or work tools within reach, domestic animals, and without the constant supervision and safe environment we consider normal today, a child could easily suffer a fatal accident. Falls, burns, drownings in wells or water buckets, or accidents with tools were daily tragedies. There were no safety regulations, no playgrounds, not even a true awareness of the constant danger to which children were exposed. Child mortality was so common that, in a way, it had become normalized. This doesn't mean parents didn't suffer. The pain was heartbreaking, but the experience was universal. Chronicles of the time, even those of the most powerful families, are full of lamentations for children who didn't reach adulthood. Take the case of Edward III of England. He had 12 children with Philippa of Hainault, but several of them died in infancy. His eldest daughter, Isabella, lived a long life, but his son, William of Hatfield, died a few months after birth. The same happened in the courts of French and Castilian royalty. The family trees of noble houses are plagued with the names of princes and princesses who never sat on the throne or married because disease took them as children. Eleanor of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand III, lost several children in early childhood. Queen Isabella the Catholic herself suffered the loss of some of her children at early ages, despite having the best care available at the time. These losses, though painful, were accepted as part of life. Prayers were offered, comfort was sought in faith, but science and medicine offered no real solutions. This normalization of death in the cradle forged a society where attachment to the newborn, at least in the early years, could be different, a kind of defense mechanism against constant pain. Families were large in number, not only due to the lack of contraceptive methods, but also as an instinctive way to ensure that some children would survive to work the land, perpetuate the lineage, or care for their parents in old age. It was a world where life was precious, but childhood was, without a doubt, a true hell. If a medieval child managed to survive the hell of the cradle, if they dodged the invisible claws of childhood diseases that decimated their siblings and neighbors, paradise did not await them. Instead, the harsh reality of a world that didn't distinguish between innocence and necessity awaited. Childhood and adolescence, as we understand them today, were alien concepts. In the Middle Ages, children were, to all intents and purposes, small adults. From a surprisingly early age, children were a vital labor force. At just 5, 6, or 7 years old, childhood abruptly ended. There was no time for endless games or carefree days. In peasant households, children helped with farm work, gathering firewood, caring for smaller animals, scaring birds from crops, or running errands. They were, in essence, extra hands that contributed to the family's survival. Imagine a 7-year-old child with calloused little hands, plowing the land with a miniature ox, or an 8-year-old girl helping her mother spin wool for endless hours under the dim light of a candle. Their still developing bodies were pushed to the limit. Exposure to physical dangers was constant. Agricultural tools, farm animals, inclement weather, accidents with open fires, a slip, a cut, a fall could have fatal consequences or leave permanent sequelae. In urban environments, the situation was no better. Children became apprentices in artisan workshops, from bakers and blacksmiths to weavers and carpenters. There, their days were as long as an adult's, working alongside masters who were often demanding and sometimes brutal. They learned the trade through repetition, blows, and the constant threat of a mistake that could cost them their livelihood. A blacksmith's apprentice, for example, was exposed to extreme heat, sparks, and handling red-hot metals. A tanner's apprentice to corrosive chemicals. Deformities, burns, and amputations were common scars of a childhood marked by labor. Let's think of Jean de Joinville, the famous chronicler of Saint Louis IX of France. Although he himself came from the nobility, his accounts indirectly reflect the hard life. Even on manorial estates, the children of serfs began working in the fields from a very young age. There was no concept of child protection as we know it today. Children were economic agents. Their value was measured by their ability to contribute to the family's sustenance. While today education is a fundamental right, in the Middle Ages, it was a luxury, a privilege reserved for a few. The majority of the medieval population, and this includes children and adolescents, were illiterate. There were no public schools or affordable books. Formal education was almost exclusively limited to the nobility and the clergy. The children of nobles could receive instruction at home, with tutors, or in monasteries, learning Latin, rhetoric, history, and, in the case of males, military and chivalric skills. Daughters of the nobility learned to manage a household, embroider, and, occasionally, to read and write. For them, knowledge was a tool of power and administration. For the rest of the population, education was eminently practical. It was learned from parents, from master artisans, from observation and imitation. A peasant learned to cultivate the land by observing his father. A girl learned to cook and sew by observing her mother. Trades were passed down from generation to generation, orally and practically. Life was the great teacher, and its lessons were harsh and direct. The lack of literacy also meant that the majority of the population was excluded from intellectual debates, from literature, and, to a large extent, from the chronicles that today allow us to understand their world. Their knowledge was local, oral, and practical, which limited their ability to adapt and progress in many spheres. As if life wasn't precarious enough, the arrival of great pandemics dealt a devastating blow to the young population. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, is the most brutal example. It not only decimated the adult population, but it swept away children and adolescents in a particularly merciless way. Cities were emptied, fields were left without hands to cultivate. It is estimated that the Black Death killed between 30% and 50% of the total European population in just a few years. But its impact on the youngest was disproportionate. Children, with still developing immune systems and often weakened by malnutrition, were especially vulnerable to the disease. Those who survived the plague often became orphans, forced to fend for themselves in a desolate world, which exposed them to new dangers such as hunger, violence, and exploitation. Chronicles of the time describe streets full of corpses and the difficulty of finding enough people to bury them. Parents burying their children, and children burying their parents. Childhood was not an age protected from catastrophe. It was the front line of sacrifice. Those who managed to survive the most acute childhood infections were not out of danger. Many diseases that did not kill directly left lifelong sequelae. Recurrent malnutrition caused rickets, bone deformities, and stunted growth. Recurrent ear infections could lead to deafness. Smallpox, if it didn't kill, left disfiguring scars that marked the person for life and could affect vision. Living conditions, lack of hygiene, and nutrient scarcity facilitated infections becoming chronic. A simple toothache could lead to a generalized infection. Poorly healed wounds could gangrene. Intestinal parasites were a constant plague that sapped energy and health. Thus, many young people reached adulthood with an already deteriorated body, with chronic ailments, and a lower resistance to future diseases. Medieval life not only shortened existence, but also diminished the quality of life for those who managed to prolong it. Finally, for males especially, adolescence brought an additional threat: violence and forced recruitment. From a very young age, males were trained in the handling of rudimentary weapons, in fighting, and in defense. In an era of constant conflict, wars were frequent, and the demand for soldiers insatiable. Adolescents could be recruited into the army or local militias from the age of 15 or 16, and sometimes even earlier, especially in times of need. There was no strict legal age for combat in many regions, and the need for hands to wield a sword or a spear outweighed any consideration of youth. They were sent into battle without the psychological or physical preparation of an adult. Their life expectancy on the battlefield was extremely low. Combat wounds, dysentery in camps, hunger during campaigns, all of this turned them into cannon fodder. Think of the Crusades, where idealistic young people from all over Europe joined military expeditions far from their homes. Many of them lacked the necessary experience to survive the rigors of travel, disease, and combat in distant lands. Or in local wars, where young peasants were dragged from their lands to defend a lord, a border, or a castle. Violence was not an abstraction. It was a palpable reality that marked the destiny of many adolescents, often with a premature and brutal end. Thus, medieval childhood and adolescence were a gloomy transition to an adulthood that, for most, arrived too soon and lasted too little. If you're listening to me at this point in the video, I hope you're already subscribed to the channel. I'm Silent of History, and my wish is to have a huge community of people who love knights and knowledge. Thousands of people from all over the world, connected by that intrinsic desire to know more, to better know oneself, and have a better life. I always say, and emphasize it, knowing history is fundamental to not repeating the mistakes of the past. And that's why I want you to take a few seconds to subscribe and share this video with your knowledge-loving friend. Not to mention if your generous spirit inspires you to give a super thank you to this humble servant. In any case, my gratitude, simply for sharing this moment, is infinite. Now, let's continue with the story. If childhood was a battlefield, medieval adulthood was a test of extreme endurance. Those who managed to overcome the innumerable dangers of childhood and adolescence did not reach maturity with a robust body prepared for a long life. On the contrary, most possessed a physical constitution that reflected years of deprivation, disease, and hard labor. Archaeological evidence, through the study of medieval skeletons, paints a revealing picture. Medieval men, on average, were short, around 1.65 meters, about 5 feet 5 inches, significantly shorter than the current average. Women were, naturally, even shorter. In addition to stature, thinness was a widespread characteristic. Their bones and teeth often showed unequivocal signs of chronic malnutrition. This was not due to different genetics, but to a diet deficient in essential nutrients and constant battles against hunger. Imagine a body that, from conception, has struggled to obtain the minimum resources to grow. A body that, in its childhood and adolescence, has been subjected to strenuous work without adequate food to replenish energy or repair tissues. Winters were long and cold, and the availability of fresh food was scarce. The basic diet consisted of cereals, legumes, and, occasionally, some meat or fish. But rations were often insufficient. This constant deficiency left an indelible mark. More fragile bones, less muscle mass, and a much lower general body resistance than we are used to today. They were functional bodies, yes, but not robust. They were made for survival, not for longevity. This is where one of the most misleading statistics in history comes in: the famous 30-year life expectancy. As we have already mentioned, this figure is brutally dragged down by the extremely high infant mortality. But what happened if, by sheer tenacity or genetic luck, you managed to survive until you were 20? Were you then expected to live a long and prosperous life? The answer is yes. Your life expectancy increased, but not as much as one might think. If a medieval man or woman managed to cross the dangerous barrier of 20 years, they would likely live to 40, or perhaps even 50. However, very few reached ages we now consider elderly, such as 60 or 70. A 50-year-old man in the Middle Ages was considered a venerable elder, with a body that reflected decades of physical exhaustion. Why this modest increase? Because even if they had escaped childhood plagues, adult life remained a constant challenge. Strenuous physical labor, recurrent diseases without cures or prevention, accumulated injuries, and lack of hygiene continued to erode health. Women faced the constant risk of childbirth, which was one of the main causes of female death. The fragility of the medieval human constitution meant that every day was a battle against wear and tear, making life short and often painful even for the fortunate. At the heart of the fragility of medieval life lay an ancestral fear, a terror that loomed like a shadow over every harvest, every winter, every mouth to feed. Hunger was not a sporadic event. For many, it was a chronic threat, an invisible yet omnipresent enemy that defined existence. Medieval Europe was, for the most part, an agrarian society. Survival depended almost entirely on what the land offered. This meant extreme vulnerability to the whims of nature. A summer too dry, an unusually long and cold winter, a spring with excessive rains that prevented planting. Any of these climatic events could trigger a food catastrophe. Global transport systems, which today allow us to import food from any corner of the planet, did not exist. If the local harvest failed, there wasn't much to turn to. Think about it. Every grain of wheat, every ear of barley, every head of cattle was the direct result of the interaction between man and land. Agricultural technology was rudimentary. Wooden plows, limited organic fertilizers, and a total dependence on animal or human power. There were no tractors, no pesticides, no genetic engineering that today guarantees abundant harvests. Life literally hung by a vegetal thread, and that thread was extraordinarily fragile. To make matters worse, medieval agriculture often relied on monoculture. Large tracts of land were dedicated to a single type of cereal, such as wheat or rye. This practice, while efficient in the short term, was a time bomb. If a specific plague or adverse climatic condition affected that particular crop, the entirety of a region's production could be lost in an instant. There was no diversification that could cushion the blow. In addition, the lack of food reserves was a constant. Production barely reached annual consumption. Surpluses, when there were any, were minimal and difficult to store for long periods due to the lack of effective preservation methods, refrigeration, etc. This meant that if one year's harvest failed, there was no safety cushion from the previous year. People literally lived day to day in terms of subsistence. A single year of bad harvest could push thousands into starvation. Empty pantries, deserted granaries, were the prelude to horror. The most terrifying and revealing example of medieval vulnerability to hunger is the Great Famine that swept across Europe between 1315 and 1317, with its effects extending until 1322. This event is often described as the first major disaster to hit Europe in the 14th century, a decade before the Black Death. And it is no exaggeration to say that it weakened the population in such a way that it made them terribly susceptible to the plague that would come later. Imagine this. Unusually cold and rainy summers followed one after another. Crops rotted in flooded fields, or simply did not germinate. Livestock died from diseases exacerbated by the lack of fodder. Food prices skyrocketed to astronomical levels, becoming unaffordable for the vast majority of the population. Chronicles of the time are a heartbreaking testimony to the desperation. People were said to be eating anything to survive: tree bark, wild herbs, roots, leaves. Animals that would normally be scorned became delicacies of last resort: dogs, cats, rats, carrion of any kind. Grain reserves ran out. Merchants' shops were assaulted by hungry mobs. Cities, once centers of activity, became living cemeteries where corpses piled up in the streets. But the horrors didn't end there. Historical sources, although with necessary caution, documented cases of cannibalism. In their desperation to survive, some went to unthinkable extremes. Parents abandoned their children, or worse, sold them into slavery to avoid watching them die slowly. There were reports of criminals taking corpses from gallows to eat them. Humanity, stripped of all dignity by hunger, revealed its darkest facets. People died of starvation in the streets, their bodies emaciated, their faces reflecting the torment of a slow and agonizing death. This episode left a deep scar on the collective memory of Europe. Estimates of deaths vary, but it is believed that millions perished, with some regions losing up to 20 to 30% of their population. The survivors were physically and psychologically exhausted, a grim omen of what was to come. The most insidious impact of hunger beyond direct death by starvation, was its devastating effect on the population's immunity. A malnourished body is a weak body. The lack of essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins severely compromised the immune system. Natural defenses collapsed. This meant that the population was extremely vulnerable to any disease. A simple flu, which under normal conditions could be overcome with a few days of rest, became fatal pneumonia. Minor infections turned into uncontrollable sepsis. Hunger didn't just kill, it opened the door wide to other forms of death. When the Black Death finally arrived in 1347, it found a Europe already weakened by decades of chronic malnutrition and periodic famines. Exhausted bodies, with their defenses depleted, were easy prey for the plague bacillus. The Great Famine was the prelude, the biological preparation that allowed the Black Death to operate with unprecedented lethal efficiency, reminding us that, sometimes, the most fearsome enemy is not the one who shouts on the battlefield, but the one who whispers in an empty stomach. If hunger was the silent enemy, infectious diseases were the constant roar of death, and relentless scourge that swept away lives regardless of age, wealth, or status. In a world without microscopes, without antibiotics, without vaccines, and with rudimentary hygiene, these diseases were the true lords of life and death, with a devastating power that today we can barely conceive. We cannot talk about medieval mortality without dedicating a central chapter to the Black Death. It was the most cataclysmic event that hit Europe in its recorded history, a biblical plague that redefined the continent. Its origin is in Central Asia, probably in the steppes, and it was transmitted to Europe through the trade routes of the Silk Road, arriving by Genoese ships at the port of Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. What arrived was not just a disease, it was annihilation. The speed of spread was terrifying. It traveled with infected rats and their fleas, which carried the Yersinia pestis bacterium. Port cities were the first to fall, and from there it spread like a wildfire across the continent. Within months, it crossed entire countries. Its lethality was horrifying. The symptoms were Dantean. Bubonic plague, the most common form, manifested with the appearance of painful and enormous swollen lymph nodes, the so-called buboes, in the groin, armpits, or neck, which could reach the size of an apple. These buboes turned black and oozed pus and blood. This was followed by high fever, chills, vomiting, extreme muscle pain, and often death within days. An even more virulent form was pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs and was transmitted from person to person through the air by coughing and sneezing, ensuring even faster spread and almost certain death. Septicemic plague, the rarest, directly attacked the bloodstream, causing internal hemorrhages and death before buboes could even appear. Imagine the panic. One day you're healthy, the next a black lump appears on your body, and in 48 hours you're dead. Entire families were annihilated. Cities like Florence saw their population halved or more. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, recounts the horror lived in Florence, where the streets were full of corpses, people died without care, and bodies piled up in mass graves, often without funeral rites, due to the sheer impossibility of digging individual graves. In London, the situation was no different. The East Smithfield Cemetery is an archaeological testimony to the thousands of people buried in haste, without coffins, without shrouds, just bodies upon bodies. The despair was palpable. People didn't understand what caused the plague. Jews, astral influences, divine punishment were blamed. Plague doctors, with their bird beak masks filled with aromatic herbs, became iconic figures of horror, more symbols of the inevitability of death than of the hope of healing. The result was an unprecedented demographic catastrophe. It is estimated that the Black Death reduced the European population by 30% to 50% in just a few years. Some calculations speak of 25 million deaths. And what's worse, the plague did not disappear. It broke out recurrently for centuries, in less lethal but equally terrifying waves, like the Great Plague of London in 1665. The simple fact that a third or half of a continent's population disappeared in 5 years gives us an idea of the brutal demographic impact and the deep mark it left on the medieval psyche. Another disease that marked medieval life, though differently from the plague, was leprosy. Caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, this chronic disease was not as lethal in itself, but it was deeply disfiguring and debilitating. Its slow and progressive evolution, affecting the skin, peripheral nerves, upper respiratory tract, eyes, and testicles, with loss of sensation and, in advanced cases, tissue disintegration, turned it into a slow and painful living death. The true horror of leprosy was not just physical, but social. It carried absolute stigma and segregation. Lepers were considered impure, sinners punished by God, or transmitters of a curse. They were forced to live in lazarets or leper colonies, institutions outside the cities, where they were isolated from the rest of society. They were forced to wear distinctive clothes, to carry a rattle or a bell to announce their presence so that healthy people could move away. And they were forbidden to touch any object that could be used by others. Imagine the life of a leper. They were given a living funeral, a ceremony in the church where they were legally declared dead to the world. They were sprinkled with holy earth. The prohibitions that would govern their existence were read to them, and they were sent to the lazaret for an existence of solitude and pain. They could not inherit, marry, or have physical contact. Food was left at the door of the lazaret, and they often begged to survive. Their suffering was a constant reminder of the fragility of body and soul. Leprosy was one of the most stigmatizing diseases of the Middle Ages, a sentence to total exclusion that, despite not killing as quickly, ensured a life of physical agony and social isolation. While the Black Death was a striking event, other diseases acted as silent killers, decimating the population recurrently. Smallpox and measles. Today, thanks to vaccines, we barely think about them. But in the Middle Ages, they were cyclical epidemics, especially devastating for children and young adults who had not yet developed immunity. Smallpox, in particular, was one of the most feared diseases. Those who survived often were left blind or with deep scars, pockmarks, that permanently disfigured the face. Measles, although often less lethal than smallpox, could cause serious complications, such as pneumonia and encephalitis, leading to death or neurological sequelae. These diseases spread rapidly through entire communities, especially in towns and cities with high population density and poor hygiene. When they reached a village, they left behind a trail of small bodies and devastated families, ensuring that infant and child mortality remained at alarmingly high levels. Two of the most common and lethal, often underestimated diseases were dysentery and typhoid fevers. Both were the direct result of chronic lack of sanitation and scarcity of clean drinking water. In an era where human and animal waste was dumped into the streets, into rivers that also served as a source of water for drinking and cooking, and where personal hygiene was minimal, contamination was inevitable. Dysentery caused severe and bloody diarrhea, extreme dehydration, and rapid death, especially in children and the elderly. Typhoid fevers caused high fevers, weakness, abdominal pain, and a characteristic skin rash. Both were endemic in medieval cities, where the accumulation of people and the lack of sanitary infrastructure created the perfect breeding ground for their spread. They were particularly devastating in military camps. An army on campaign, with thousands of men crowded together in unsanitary conditions, with limited access to clean water and spoiled food, was a perfect breeding ground for these diseases. More soldiers died from dysentery and typhus than from combat wounds. A siege of a city not only involved a military encirclement, but a de facto biological war, where disease decimated both the besieged and the besiegers. Finally, we cannot forget the impact of climate and living conditions on medieval health. Winters were harsh, and medieval dwellings lacked adequate heating and insulation. Houses were cold, damp, and often drafty. People huddled together to keep warm, which facilitated the transmission of respiratory diseases. Tuberculosis, the king's evil or consumption, was a chronic and devastating disease that affected people of all ages. It progressively weakened the body, causing persistent cough, fever, night sweats, and emaciation. It could drag on for years, undermining the person's life and infecting their family. Pneumonia and bronchitis, exacerbated by cold, dampness, and overcrowding, were common causes of death, especially in the winter months. A simple cold could lead to a fatal lung infection. These respiratory diseases were the ice on the body, sapping vital strength and leaving survivors even more weakened and vulnerable to the next infection. In the Middle Ages, the air you breathed and the house that protected you from the cold could paradoxically be the causes of your own condemnation. Thus, infectious diseases wove a web of fatality that, along with hunger and the general precariousness of life, guaranteed a short existence marked by suffering. If disease and hunger were the silent executioners, war was the loudest and most brutal reaper of young lives. In the Middle Ages, armed conflict was not a distant event or a faraway news item. It was a constant and palpable reality that could erupt at any moment, dragging men, and sometimes even dolls and even children, into a whirlwind of violence and death. The glory and honor of the knights we see in chivalric romances concealed a much harsher and bloodier reality for the vast majority who wielded a weapon. Let's forget for a moment the romantic image of the armored knight. The vast majority of medieval armies were made up of foot soldiers and militias, meaning forcibly recruited peasants. These men, torn from their fields and families, had little to no formal military training. Their combat experience was limited to daily life in the countryside, which made them vulnerable and clumsy in the heat of organized battle. Imagine a farmer accustomed to handling a plow. Suddenly, he is given a crude spear or a hand axe. Their equipment was often their own peasant clothing, perhaps a wooden shield if they were lucky, and improvised or non-existent armor. They lacked the discipline, cohesion, and weaponry of professional forces, which were a minority. This made them, literally, cannon fodder, destined to absorb the enemy's first onslaught, while knights and more experienced infantry operated behind or on the flanks. Their life expectancy in a direct confrontation was sadly short. Medieval weapons were brutally effective at causing devastating wounds. There were no bullets, but there was the blunt force of steel and wood. Swords of various sizes and shapes were designed to cut and stab. A sword blow could sever a limb open a deep wound that tore organs, or shatter bones irreparably. Axes were formidable impact weapons, capable of crushing skulls or splitting shields and armor. Spears were ideal for keeping the enemy at bay and creating dense formations, but a spear thrust could pierce the body from side to side. Bows, especially English longbows or crossbows, launched arrows with a force capable of penetrating light armor or causing puncture wounds that rarely healed cleanly. Consider the magnitude of the damage. A wound treatable today with sutures and antibiotics was a death sentence in the Middle Ages. A deep cut quickly became infected. An open fracture was not properly set and could lead to amputation or lifelong disability. There was no anesthesia, no knowledge of sterilization, no adequate surgical tools. The field surgeon, often more a barber than a doctor, had to deal with tears, uncontrollable bleeding, and shattered limbs. Death from infection, gangrene, or blood loss was much more common than direct death on the battlefield. Pitched battles, however brutal, were often not the primary cause of mortality. Paradoxically, most soldiers died from campaign conditions. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion were much more persistent and lethal enemies than any opposing army. Medieval armies did not have efficient supply chains. Soldiers were often forced to live off the land, plundering fields and villages they passed through for food. This led to malnutrition and the consumption of spoiled food. Drinking water was scarce and often contaminated. Thousands of men and animals huddled in improvised camps without basic sanitation. Waste accumulated, creating the perfect breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, that scourge of uncontrollable diarrhea, was the main killer. It spread like wildfire in the camps, weakening soldiers to the point of starvation or death by dehydration. Typhoid fever, typhus, and other infectious diseases were also endemic. A clear example is Frederick Barbarossa's crusade in the 12th century, where more crusaders died from diseases on the long journey to the Holy Land than from the Saracens. Exposure to the elements, cold, rain, extreme heat, without adequate shelter, caused hypothermia, pneumonia, and other respiratory diseases. A medieval soldier not only fought against an armed enemy, but against the environment itself, against the disease incubating in every puddle, in every spoiled ration of food. Sieges were perhaps the most prolonged and agonizing form of warfare. The objective was not a quick battle, but to strangle a city into submission. Besieged cities became death traps for their inhabitants. Hunger and thirst were the besiegers' first weapons. As provisions ran out, people died of starvation. Water became contaminated or inaccessible. But the most horrifying was the outbreak of diseases within the walls. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and malnutrition turned the city into a gigantic hotbed of infection. Dysentery, plague, and other scourges ravaged inhabitants and defenders alike. Chroniclers of the time, such as Jean Froissart during the 100 Years' War, describe how besieged cities were filled with corpses that often could not be buried due to lack of space or the weakness of the survivors. And then there was the macabre art of medieval biological warfare. Besiegers sometimes catapulted corpses of animals or people dead from infectious diseases, even the plague, over the city walls. The goal was to spread diseases among the defenders and the civilian population, weakening them and forcing their surrender. Excrement, garbage, and all kinds of putrid material were thrown to contaminate water sources and the air. The siege of Kaffa in 1346, where the Mongols reportedly launched corpses of plague victims over the Genoese city, is a notorious example, although its actual impact on the spread of the Black Death to Europe is debated. In any case, the intention of biological warfare was clear: to transform the besieged city into a mass tomb. The Crusades are a paradigmatic example of the extremely high mortality of medieval soldiers. Millions of Europeans, many of them young, embarked on these armed pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Death from disease and battle was omnipresent. The journeys were long and exhausting, sanitary conditions deplorable, and endemic diseases in the Middle East, to which Europeans had no immunity, wreaked havoc. Entire camps were decimated by dysentery, typhus, and malaria before the enemy was even seen. Many crusaders never reached the Holy Land, dying on the way from illness or hunger. Battles were fierce, but disease and malnutrition were the true invisible enemies that claimed the most lives. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France is another testament to the brutality of medieval warfare and its impact on life expectancy. Battles like Crécy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Agincourt, 1415, are famous for massive casualties. In these battles, the French heavy cavalry, symbol of nobility and military power, proved surprisingly vulnerable to the showers of arrows from English archers. Thousands of men died in a matter of hours, bleeding to death on the battlefield, crushed by horses, or finished off by enemy troops. But even after the battle, death continued to take its toll. The wounded were abandoned, often agonizing for days before dying from infections or exposure. Prisoners without ransom value were executed. War was not just a clash of armies. It was an event that destabilized entire regions, caused famines, spread diseases, and ensured that the youth who survived childhood were not guaranteed a long and peaceful life. Medieval warfare was, in essence, a factory of widows and orphans, a great mill that ground young lives with merciless efficiency. Let us now delve into an equally lethal aspect of medieval life, one that had nothing to do with nature, but with human nature itself in its rawest state: the violence and justice of the era, a system where mercy was a rarity and escape a chimera. Imagine a world where you not only fear disease or hunger, but also the constant threat of violence in your own neighborhood, on the way to the market, or even from justice itself. The Middle Ages, often idealized, was in reality a period of endemic violence, where human life had a different value, and laws were often as brutal as the crimes they sought to punish. For the medieval man, death did not only lurk on the battlefield or in a sickbed. He could also find it in a dark corner or on the gallows in the public square. The absence of a strong centralized state and effective police forces meant that crime rates were alarmingly high. Robbery, assault, and private revenge were not isolated incidents. They were part of the daily fabric of life. Extreme poverty and food shortages pushed many to desperation and theft. A stolen piece of bread could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Small neighborhood disputes could quickly escalate into violent assaults. Laws, although they existed, were often weak, inconsistent, and, in many cases, corrupt or subject to the whim of local lords. There was no unified police force that patrolled the streets or roads. Law enforcement fell to local sheriffs, bailiffs, or the feudal lords themselves, whose authority could be easily bribed or ignored. If you were a peasant without influence, you had little chance of obtaining justice against a noble or even a wealthy merchant. This weakness of the legal system encouraged self-justice and an endless cycle of revenge and retaliation, where families and clans engaged in feuds that could last for generations. The life of a medieval man was a constant exercise in vigilance, not only against the highwayman, but also against the neighbor or rival who might feel entitled to personal compensation. When a criminal was caught and judged, a relatively rare occurrence, by the way, given how difficult it was to apprehend criminals, medieval justice was a spectacle of horror and a brutal warning. Cruel and capital punishments were the norm, designed not only to punish, but to terrorize the population and deter any future transgression. Mutilations were common and grotesque. For thieves, the penalty could be the loss of a hand, a public amputation that marked them for life as criminals and literally prevented them from earning a living. Imagine a man with a bleeding stump, wandering the streets, a walking testimony to the price of transgression. Ears or noses could be cut off for minor offenses or for perjury, leaving the offender disfigured and publicly humiliated. Floggings were a common punishment for a variety of crimes, from petty theft to blasphemy. The body of the punished was publicly displayed and scourged, a ritual of pain and shame designed to humiliate and warn others. But the height of brutality was capital punishment. Pyres were reserved for the most serious crimes against faith and moral order: heresy, witchcraft, sodomy, treason. Death by fire was a slow and terrifying agony, seen as a purification of the soul and an exemplary punishment for corrupt bodies. Gallows were ubiquitous structures at the entrance to cities or in public squares, permanent symbols of the Lord's power and the fate of transgressors. The bodies of the hanged were often left exposed for days or weeks, swinging in the wind, to serve as a macabre warning to anyone who dared to defy the law. These executions were public events, a form of macabre entertainment for the masses, and a tool of social control that etched fear into the minds of the population. Cruelty was not a side effect, it was the purpose. In an era where reason and forensic evidence were limited, justice often resorted to the divine. Trials by God, or ordeals, were extreme physical tests believed to reveal the accused's guilt or innocence through divine intervention. It wasn't about seeking evidence, but about submitting to God's will. The ordeal of fire. The accused had to walk over red-hot coals or hold a glowing iron. If, after a few days, the wounds healed cleanly or no blisters formed, God was considered to have attested to their innocence. Of course, the possibility of emerging unscathed was nil, guaranteeing at least severe burns and the risk of infection. The ordeal of cold water. The accused, with hands and feet tied, was thrown into a body of blessed water. If they sank, they were innocent, as the pure water accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty, as the water rejected them. Evidently, this test was a death sentence for most, who drowned, and a guilty verdict for the few who, due to some physical peculiarity, managed to float. The ordeal of boiling water. The accused had to put their bare hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve an object. The result of the burns determined their fate. And then there was trial by combat, generally reserved for the nobility. Two contenders, accuser and accused, faced each other in a duel to the death or until submission. It was believed that God would grant victory to the innocent. For medieval man, these were not senseless tortures, but acts of faith, where divine intervention was expected, and often sentenced the guilty or the unlucky to death. Although the Church formally condemned ordeals at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, their practice persisted in some forms and mentalities. Beyond formal justice, medieval life was intrinsically linked to vendettas and feudal law. In the absence of a centralized judiciary capable of effectively resolving disputes, private revenge, or feuds was an accepted form of justice, especially among noble families and clans. An insult, a cattle theft, a murder. Any grievance could trigger a cycle of violence between families that could last for years, with bloody killings and reprisals. Honor and the obligation to avenge the affront weighed heavily on the shoulders of young men, dragging them into dangerous conflicts. Furthermore, men were constantly embroiled in the conflicts of their lords or clans. Feudal society was based on oaths of loyalty and military service. If your feudal lord decided to go to war with a neighbor, or if a land dispute erupted, you, as his vassal or peasant, were drawn into that conflict, often without choice. Your lands could be plundered, your family threatened, and you yourself could be forcibly recruited to fight, even if you had no personal interest in the dispute. The life of a medieval man was, therefore, tied to the fortune of his lord, exposing him to violence not by his own actions, but by imposed loyalty or mere geographical proximity to a conflict. The figure of Robin Hood, although semi-legendary, reflects the reality of banditry in the Middle Ages. In a world with dense forests and weak authorities, outlaw groups were common. Some were simple thieves, others, men displaced by war or poverty, who sought subsistence by force. Several historical cases of bandits and law rebels existed in England and France, demonstrating that the outlaw was a recurring figure in a society with great inequalities and few escape routes from misery. Being a victim of bandits on rural roads was a constant risk for anyone traveling. Public executions were massive events. They took place in the central squares of important cities, such as the Place de Grève in Paris, or on the outskirts, near the gates. Entire crowds gathered to witness hangings, beheadings, burnings at the stake, or public tortures. Bodies, as we mentioned, were often left on display on the gallows or hung in cages to serve as a warning. In cities like Florence, after conspiracies or revolts, the executions of traitors were particularly cruel, with dismemberments or the display of their heads on pikes on the city walls. These acts were not only punishments, but also reaffirmations of the ruler's power and a grim reminder that in the Middle Ages, life was cheap and death, a spectacle. Beyond wars, plagues, and famine, there was a silent and constant enemy that took a daily toll in lives and limbs: workplace accidents. In an era without safety regulations, without modern machinery, and with rudimentary tools, work was inherently a dangerous activity. Survival came at a high price, often paid with physical integrity or life itself. The majority of the medieval population were peasants, and agricultural work was fraught with dangers. Imagine the constant physical effort, plowing the land with heavy plows, pulled by animals, sowing by hand, harvesting under the inclement sun. Cuts with sickles and scythes were extremely common, and an open wound in the field, without proper disinfection, easily became a fatal infection. Accidents with plows pulled by oxen or horses could result in trampling, broken bones, or internal injuries. Kicks or goring from farm animals, such as cows, horses, or pigs, could cause serious trauma or death, especially for children who were often near these beasts. In addition, field work involved constant exposure to the elements: sunstroke, hypothermia, insect bites, or bites from venomous animals. A simple twisted ankle in the middle of planting could mean days of inactivity, jeopardizing the sustenance of the entire family. The medieval ambition to build imposing castles, majestic Gothic cathedrals, and grand public buildings came with an immense human cost. Construction was one of the most dangerous professions. Without modern cranes, safe scaffolding, or hard hats, every day of work was a gamble with life. Scaffolding was precarious wooden structures, often built without plans and with recycled materials. Falls from great heights were frequent and almost always fatal. Imagine a worker dozens of meters from the ground, transporting heavy stones or wooden beams on scaffolding that swayed with every gust of wind. Crushings by loose stones or beams were daily tragedies. A misplaced stone or a beam that gave way could kill or mutilate several men in an instant. Examples abound in the chronicles of Gothic cathedral construction. Many workers are known to have lost their lives building works like Chartres Cathedral or Cologne Cathedral. Each cathedral was, in a way, a monument to human ingenuity, and at the same time, a silent charnel house for the countless workers who sacrificed their lives in its construction. If there was one job that embodied the price of survival, it was mining. Medieval miners worked in hellish conditions. The galleries were narrow, dark, and without adequate ventilation. Collapses were a constant danger, as support structures were rudimentary and excavation methods basic. The lack of light made accidents inevitable. A simple slip could mean a fall into a pit or a flooded mine. Inhalation of toxic gases, such as methane or carbon monoxide, was a silent and lethal threat that caused suffocation without warning. In addition, miners suffered from chronic lung diseases due to the dust and fumes they constantly inhaled. Tools were heavy and rudimentary, increasing the risk of accidents with tools that could cause amputations or serious injuries in the dark. A miner's life was, by definition, a sentence to a short existence, marked by disease and the constant risk of a violent and sudden death in the bowels of the earth. Even in the apparent refuge of an artisan workshop, the dangers were significant. Artisans were exposed to a series of risks inherent to their trade. Cuts with sharp tools, carpenter's knives, stonecutters' chisels, tanner's needles, were common and could lead to severe infections. Blacksmiths suffered constant burns from forge fires and red-hot metal, and the inhalation of smoke and metal vapors affected their lungs long-term. Tanners, for example, worked with animal hides and a series of chemicals, such as urine or excrement, rich in ammonia, which produced toxic vapors. Constant inhalation of these vapors damaged the respiratory tract and lungs. Dyers and potters also handled substances that we now know were toxic. There was no awareness of respiratory protection or adequate ventilation. Occupational diseases, injuries, and deformities were the price of a life dedicated to production, making it clear that, in the Middle Ages, every trade, however humble, could be a slow death sentence or a path to permanent disability. Let's continue our journey through the shadowy realities of medieval life. And now we will face one of its most terrifying aspects for us moderns: medicine, a practice that, all too often, proved more dangerous than curative. In the Middle Ages, falling ill was not just a matter of bad luck. It was, in many cases, the beginning of torture, an odyssey of pain that, with alarming probability, ended in death. The medicine of the time was a battlefield where ignorance clashed with desperation, and where remedies were often worse than the ailment itself. The great obstacle to medieval medicine was an almost total lack of knowledge of the human body. Although there were some isolated advances, the Church usually prohibited the dissection of corpses, which prevented doctors from acquiring real knowledge of anatomy and physiology. What was known was based on ancient texts, often Greek and Roman, such as those of Galen, whose authority was unquestionable, even when his theories were erroneous. The understanding of disease was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that disease was the result of an imbalance of these humors, and treatment consisted of restoring that balance. This theory, although logical for the time, was fundamentally incorrect. Superstitions played a huge role. It was believed in the influence of the stars, in the power of magic, in illness as punishment for sins. How to cure what was not even understood? Medicine was, Jamawa Izan was in essence a guessing game, and the human body, a black box. Any invasive medical intervention was a sentence of unbearable pain and an extremely high risk of infection. The absence of anesthesia meant that patients were fully conscious during procedures, screaming and struggling, which greatly hindered the surgeon's work and increased the patient's trauma. Rudimentary containment techniques were used, such as cloths to bite on or assistants holding the patient. But the horror of the scalpel without numbing was a palpable reality. But if pain was hell, the absence of antiseptics was the final scythe. Germs were unknown. Surgical instruments were used dirty from one patient to another. The surgeon's hands were not washed. Wounds were not properly cleaned. Operations were performed in unsanitary environments, often in the patient's own home or in a workshop. It was almost a certainty that any open wound, whether from an accident or surgery, would become severely infected. Infection, gangrene, and septicemia were the main causes of post-operative death. A successful amputation, in the sense that the patient did not die on the table, had a 50% chance of ending in a slow and agonizing death from infection in the following days. The medieval healthcare system was a peculiar amalgam of practices and professionals. University doctors were educated men who had studied the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates in universities. Paradoxically, their education was more theoretical than practical. They did not touch the patient. Their work consisted of diagnosing based on urine observation, uroscopy, pulse, and interrogation, and then prescribing treatments. They considered surgery manual labor, beneath their intellectual dignity, and therefore did not practice it. Barber surgeons were in charge of physical interventions. They were artisans, not intellectuals. Their experience came from practice, and often from military experience. They shaved, bled, extracted teeth, and performed major operations, such as amputations or stone extractions. Their skill varied enormously, but they operated without any knowledge of hygiene or real internal anatomy. They were the medieval version of the field surgeon in their crudest expression. And finally, there were the popular healers, midwives, and herbalists. These were often the first and only resources for most of the rural population. Their remedies were based on folklore, tradition, medicinal herbs, some effective, many useless, magic, or superstition. Their practices were a mix of popular wisdom and dangerous nonsense, but they were accessible to common people who could not afford a university doctor or a barber surgeon. The basis of many treatments, following the theory of humors, was bloodletting. It was believed that by removing excess blood, one of the humors, balance was restored. Patients were frequently bled excessively, which weakened them further, causing anemia, dizziness, and, in extreme cases, death from blood loss, especially if they were already weakened by illness or malnutrition. Violent purges with emetics and laxatives were another pillar of treatment. Herbs and substances with potent diuretic and laxative effects were administered to cleanse the body of malignant humors. This caused severe dehydration and extreme exhaustion. Remedies based on urine, animal feces, or even toxic metals like mercury or lead were sadly common. It was believed that these substances had mystical or purifying properties, but in reality, they caused poisoning and worsened the patient's condition. The ingestion of mercury to treat syphilis, for example, caused terrible neurological and dental deterioration. Most medieval treatments, far from curing, put the patient's body in an even more vulnerable situation. Medieval surgeries are a testament to the harshness of the era. There were no clean cuts, only the crude reality of the agony-inducing scalpel. Amputations were frequent, especially to treat severe compound fractures or life-threatening infections. They were performed quickly, with an unsterilized saw, with the patient conscious, and the wound was cauterized with red-hot iron to stop the bleeding, a procedure that left a horrible scar and unimaginable pain. Trepanations, the drilling of the skull to relieve pressure on the brain or release evil spirits, were performed with primitive instruments. If the patient did not die on the table from brain trauma or hemorrhage, subsequent infection was almost a certainty. The extraction of bladder stones was a common and painful procedure. The surgeon used a knife to make an incision in the perineum, inserting their fingers or forceps to extract the painful stones. The survival rate was low, and complications such as fistulas or infections were frequent. These procedures were the height of brutality, performed in conditions that seem unimaginable today, and often they were the last hope for a dying patient, a hope that, unfortunately, was usually in vain. To understand how dangerous medieval medicine could be, there is no better example than the tragic, yet instructive death of King Henry II of Castile, which occurred in 1379. This episode not only illustrates the medical incompetence of the time, but also how treatments, supposedly intended to cure, could become the coup de grace, even for a monarch with access to the best specialists of his time. Henry, a man around 46 years old, who had spent much of his adult life consolidating his throne through constant wars and conspiracies, was the first king of the Trastamara dynasty, coming to power after a bloody civil war against his half-brother Peter the Cruel. He was no stranger to the harshness of life. However, in that year, he was struck by a serious illness. The chronicles of the time are not precise enough for a modern diagnosis, but historians suggest it could have been apoplexy, a cerebral hemorrhage, or even poisoning. It was rumored he had been poisoned by an apple. What we do know is that his condition was critical, and he needed urgent attention. This is where medieval medicine comes into play. The court physicians, men trained in the universities of Montpellier, Paris, or Salamanca, were the most renowned of the time. However, their knowledge was based almost exclusively on Galen's theory of the four humors and other classical authors we have already mentioned. For them, Henry's illness was due to an imbalance of these humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile that resided in his body. The solution, according to their dogma, was simple: eliminate the excess humor to restore harmony. And the most common method to achieve this was bloodletting. They decided that the king's illness was due to an excess of blood. Thus, with the solemnity appropriate to the situation, they proceeded to bleed the monarch from the cephalic vein in his left arm. Imagine the scene. The king, prostrate, weakened by illness, surrounded by his advisors and the doctors, who with a scalpel or lancet, probably unsterilized, opened the vein and let the blood flow into a vessel. There was no exact measure, no volume control. Blood was extracted until the patient felt dizzy, or the doctor believed he had removed enough of the noxious humor. The effect of this cure was, to the king's misfortune and his doctor's perplexity, dramatically negative. Instead of improving, Henry II rapidly worsened. A body already weakened by a severe illness was deprived of a considerable volume of blood, which likely caused circulatory collapse, hypovolemic shock, or acute anemia that his organism could not withstand. The following hours saw an unstoppable deterioration. Despite desperate efforts, or perhaps precisely because of the continuation of other equally ineffective remedies, Henry II died a few hours after the bloodletting. His death, at a relatively young age for a king, 46, became a grim reminder of the impotence of medicine of his time. Not only could they not cure him, but in a cruel twist of fate, the treatment they administered was, most likely, the direct cause of his fatal outcome. The bleeding, intended to balance, ended up completely unbalancing his life. This case of the death of a powerful monarch, with all resources at his disposal, encapsulates the fragility of medieval life in the face of illness. It demonstrates how medical treatments, based on a mistaken understanding of the body, and without the proper tools, knowledge of anatomy, asepsis, anesthesia, transfusions, could all too often be a death sentence disguised as salvation. The cure was not only ineffective, but transformed into the coup de grace, sealing the fate of those who sought relief and underscoring the terrible reality that, in the Middle Ages, falling ill was, in itself, a mortal risk. If the medieval body suffered, the mind was no less vulnerable. However, unlike wounds or fevers, mental suffering was a silent hell, often misunderstood, and, therefore, addressed with a brutality that only increased the torment. In the Middle Ages, mental illness was not understood as a medical condition. The manifestations of what we would today call psychosis, severe depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorders were interpreted in much darker and more mystical ways. Madness was seen, predominantly, as a sign of demonic possession, a divine punishment for sins, or a form of witchcraft. A person who suddenly suffered hallucinations, delusions, or extreme behavioral changes was not taken to a hospital. They were taken to the church, or worse, tied up and isolated. This misunderstanding meant that there was no compassionate treatment based on reason. The mentally ill were feared, stigmatized, and often considered a threat or a shame to their families. Treatments for what was considered possession were as terrifying as the condition itself. Exorcisms were common, rituals designed to expel the demon from the person's body. These procedures could be long, exhausting, and often violent, subjecting the individual to sleep deprivation, forced fasting, incessant prayers, and, in some cases, physical abuse in an attempt to shake out the demon. When exorcism failed, or the person was too dangerous, more drastic measures were resorted to. Chaining and isolation were common practices. People with severe mental illnesses were tied, caged, or locked in cells, often in inhumane conditions, without hygiene or significant human contact. It was believed that physical pain or suffering could cleanse the body of the evil spirit, leading to cleanings by violent means, such as floggings, icy cold showers, or burns. Far from curing, these brutalities further traumatized the individual, pushing them into an abyss of suffering and despair from which few could escape. And beyond the extreme cases of madness, the very brutality of medieval life generated immense psychological stress and chronic trauma for most of the population. The constant threats of hunger, disease, and war created a state of perpetual anxiety and fear. Seeing loved ones die brutally and suddenly, the loss of children in infancy, the omnipresent violence, and the lack of control over one's own destiny left deep scars on the psyche. Post-traumatic stress disorders, although unrecognized, were undoubtedly common among survivors of famines, plagues, or conflicts. Depression and anxiety were silent companions to countless lives. Without a concept of mental health, without therapy, without psychological support, people simply had to endure. Emotional and mental suffering was internalized, manifested in physical illnesses, somatization, or expressed through faith, superstition, or, unfortunately, violence. Mental health in the Middle Ages was truly a silent hell that could not be spoken of or find relief. History is riddled with whimsical destinies, but few as dazzling and brief as that of Alexander the Great. Born in the spring of 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon, his life did not extend beyond 32 years. However, in that handful of decades, this man became the architect of a vast empire, the catalyst of a new cultural era, and a name synonymous with conquest and legend that resonates to this day. Alexander was not an ordinary newborn. His father, Philip II, was the cunning and ambitious king of Macedon, who had transformed his kingdom from a barbaric periphery into the dominant power of Greece. His mother, Olympias, Princess of Epirus, was a strong, mystical, and often volatile figure who instilled in her son the belief in his divine origin and a deep sense of destiny. Legends and prodigies surrounded his birth. It was said that the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned down the same night he came into the world, a sign that something extraordinary had arrived. From a young age, Alexander showed fierce intelligence and an indomitable will. The anecdote of how, as a teenager, he tamed the untamed horse Bucephalus, realizing that it feared its own shadow, already foreshadowed his genius for seeing beyond the obvious and his ability to overcome the insurmountable. Philip, aware of his son's potential, made a momentous decision. In 343 BC, he hired Aristotle himself, the greatest philosopher of his time, to be Alexander's tutor. For 3 years, at the Temple of the Nymphs in Mieza, Alexander and a select group of young nobles, including his inseparable friend and eventual general, Hephaestion, received an encyclopedic education. Aristotle instilled in him knowledge of philosophy, ethics, politics, medicine, natural sciences, and, crucially, a deep passion for Greek literature, especially Homer's Iliad. Alexander idolized Achilles, carrying with him a copy of the poem annotated by Aristotle, and saw in the Trojan hero the model for his own ambition and military glory. This training would lay the foundations for his worldview and his leadership. Alexander's destiny took an abrupt turn in 336 BC. Philip II, at the pinnacle of his power, was assassinated amidst festivities for his daughter's marriage. Although the exact causes are debated, with Olympias and even Alexander himself among the suspects, what followed was a demonstration of the young prince's coolness and determination. At just 20 years old, Alexander moved with astonishing speed and cruelty to secure his throne. He eliminated all possible rivals and those who had conspired against his father. When the Greek city-states, believing Macedon was weakened, revolted, Alexander acted with brutal force. The city of Thebes, one of the proudest in Greece, dared to resist. Alexander completely razed it, massacred its inhabitants, and sold the survivors into slavery, leaving only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar safe. It was a chilling warning to the rest of Greece. The new Macedonian king was no less formidable than his father. With Greece under his thumb, Alexander also inherited Philip's great dream, the invasion of the powerful Persian Empire. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the border between Europe and Asia, with an army of about 40,000 men. The act was symbolic. He plunged his spear into Asian soil, claiming it as his own. The clash was imminent. The first great test came in the Battle of the Granicus, 334 BC. The Persian satraps gathered a considerable force, but Alexander personally led the charge, almost perishing in hand-to-hand combat. His reckless bravery, which cost him several wounds throughout his life, earned him the fanatical loyalty of his troops. After this victory, the Greek cities of Asia Minor acclaimed him as a liberator. Alexander's path was not built only with battles. His intellect manifested in the famous episode of the Gordian Knot, 333 BC. Legend said that whoever untied this intricate knot would reign over Asia. Alexander, instead of patiently untangling it, drew his sword and cut it with a single stroke, an act that symbolized his direct and decisive approach to problems. The true test of fire came with the confrontation with the great Persian king himself, Darius III. The Battle of Issus, 333 BC, was an epic clash in a narrow mountain pass. Despite overwhelming Persian numerical superiority, Alexander's tactical genius and the discipline of the Macedonian phalanx crushed Darius's army. The Persian king, to his shame, fled the battlefield, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children, who were captured by Alexander. The honorable treatment the young king gave them surprised the ancient world and forged his reputation for magnanimity. Instead of pursuing Darius, Alexander turned south, securing the Phoenician coast to neutralize Persian naval power. The Siege of Tyre, 332 BC, was a brutal engineering feat. The city, an island fortress, resisted for 7 months, but Alexander built a gigantic causeway to reach it, demonstrating his relentless determination. After the fall of Tyre, the road to Egypt was open. In Egypt, he was received as a liberator from the Persian yoke. He visited the Oracle of Siwa, where he was proclaimed son of Zeus Ammon, which reinforced his belief in his divinity. Here, he founded the city of Alexandria, which would become one of the most important cultural and commercial centers of the Hellenistic world. The final confrontation with Darius III took place on the vast plain of Gaugamela in 331 BC. It was the largest battle of antiquity, with hundreds of thousands of combatants. Darius had gathered all the might of his empire, including scythed chariots and war elephants. But Alexander's brilliant strategy, his famous oblique formation, and his charge of companion cavalry shattered the Persian line. Darius fled for a second time, and the Macedonian victory was decisive. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the East for 2 centuries, had fallen. Alexander entered Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the Persian capitals, triumphantly, seizing immense treasures. The burning of Persepolis, Darius's ceremonial city, was a symbolic act of revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens during the Persian Wars. With Darius III murdered by his own satraps, Bessus, Alexander proclaimed himself his successor and continued his advance eastward, entering the remote and wild regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, present-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. Here the war changed. These were not pitched battles, but an exhausting guerrilla war against indomitable mountain tribes. The campaign lasted for years, with constant skirmishes and sieges of impregnable fortresses. It was in this region that Alexander married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, in a gesture of cultural integration that was not always well received by his Macedonian soldiers. Tensions in the army increased. His adoption of Persian customs, such as proskynesis, prostrating before the king, offended his Macedonian soldiers, who were accustomed to equality between their kings and nobles. Alexander, in moments of rage, even killed Clytus the Black, one of his most veteran generals, and the man who had saved his life at Granicus, over an argument during a banquet. He also clashed with his historian Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle, which led him to execute him. Megalomania was beginning to cloud his genius. Despite everything, Alexander pressed on, crossed the formidable Hindu Kush mountain range, and descended into the Indian subcontinent. There, he faced new challenges, powerful kingdoms, and the fearsome sight of war elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC, against King Porus and his mighty elephants, was one of his hardest-fought victories. Alexander, once again, demonstrated his tactical mastery by crossing a swollen river and outflanking the enemy, achieving a decisive victory, albeit at a high cost. But even Alexander's charisma had limits. At the Hyphasis River, his troops, exhausted by years of endless campaigning, by the extreme climate, and by rumors of monsters and giant armies beyond, mutinied. They refused to go any further. It was the only time Alexander had to give in to his men, a deep frustration for him, who dreamed of reaching the end of the known world. The journey back was even more hellish. He decided to return by a different route through the Gedrosian Desert, present-day Balochistan. It was a brutal march, where thousands of soldiers died of thirst, hunger, and exhaustion. It was a test of endurance, as hard as or harder than any battle. Simultaneously, he sent his admiral Nearchus to explore the maritime route through the Indian Ocean, demonstrating his inexhaustible curiosity and strategic vision. Upon returning to the central provinces of his empire, Alexander found chaos. Governors and satraps had abused their power, believing the king would not return. Alexander acted with a firm hand, executing many and restoring order. He began to implement his vision of a fused empire, integrating Persian nobles into his army and administration. At the Susa weddings, 324 BC, a massive ceremony, he ordered thousands of his Macedonian soldiers and officers to marry noble Persian women, an ambitious attempt to unify the two cultures. The hardest blow for Alexander was the death of his childhood friend and lifelong companion, Hephaestion, in 324 BC. Alexander's grief was immense and manifested in exaggerated mourning and acts of cruelty against those he believed responsible. Some historians suggest that this loss may have affected his mental and physical health. In the months leading up to his death, Alexander was in Babylon planning new expeditions, including the invasion of Arabia and the exploration of the Caspian. He was a man of limitless ambition, always looking towards the next horizon. But the end came unexpectedly. In June 323 BC, Alexander fell ill with a persistent and debilitating fever. The symptoms, high fever, joint pain, delirium, have led historians and doctors to propose various causes: malaria, typhoid fever, encephalitis, or even possible poisoning, although there is no conclusive evidence. For 11 days, his health deteriorated. His desperate soldiers were allowed to parade by his bedside, a final farewell to their leader. When asked to whom he left his empire, his supposed answer was, "To the strongest," or "to the most worthy," sowing the seeds of decades of conflicts that would follow among his generals, the Diadochi. Alexander the Great died on June 10, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. Although his empire fragmented almost immediately after his death, Alexander the Great's impact was immense. His brief but incredibly intense life left a legacy that altered the course of history, the Hellenistic era. Alexander was the catalyst for the Hellenization of the Eastern world. The spread of Greek as a lingua franca and the propagation of Greek culture, philosophy, art, and science across vast expanses of Asia and Africa created a new cultural paradigm that would endure for centuries. City founding. The dozens of cities he founded, many named Alexandria, became commercial and cultural centers, uniting East and West. Military genius. His military tactics and strategies, studied by leaders like Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte, revolutionized ancient warfare and are still analyzed in modern military academies. Inspiration and myth. The figure of Alexander, the warrior king, the unstoppable conqueror. The man who defied the gods became a source of inspiration and fascination, permeating literature, art, and the collective imagination for millennia. The life of Alexander the Great is a captivating testament to how a brief existence, lived with unparalleled intensity, can leave an indelible mark on the tapestry of humanity. His boundless ambition and his genius, which burned with blinding intensity, quickly consumed his life, but ignited a light that illuminated and transformed the world forever. If we seek another monarch whose life was as short as it was impactful, though not as young as Alexander the Great when he died, but who also left an indelible mark, we must speak of Richard IV of England, universally known as Richard the Lionheart. Born in Oxford in 1157, this warrior king died in 1199 at the age of 41. Although he crossed the 30-year barrier, his life was a whirlwind of constant conflict, and his reign, though brief, was dominated by his incessant pursuit of military glory, particularly in the Crusades. His figure is the epitome of the crusading knight, but his story is also that of a king who spent more time fighting abroad than ruling his own kingdom. Richard was the third legitimate son of two of the most powerful and turbulent figures of his time, Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His father, Henry, was the founder of the vast Angevin Empire that encompassed England and much of France, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Brittany. His mother, Eleanor, was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and will, and one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. From a young age, Richard showed no interest in administration or domestic politics. His passion was war. Educated at his mother's court in Poitiers, the young prince grew up immersed in the chivalric culture of southern France. He was a natural leader, brave to the point of recklessness, and a brilliant military strategist. His relationship with his father, Henry II, was stormy and marked by constant rebellions. Along with his brothers, Richard took up arms against Henry on several occasions, often instigated by his own mother. This family dynamic of intrigue and betrayal was a constant in Richard's life. He spent his youth fighting to secure his dominion over Aquitaine and Poitou, hardening himself in the relentless reality of feudal warfare. It was not until Henry II's death in 1180 that Richard, at 32 years old, ascended to the throne of England. Richard was crowned King of England, but his gaze was already set on the East. From a young age, he had sworn to participate in the Third Crusade, launched in response to the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin. To finance his ambitious expedition, Richard drained England's coffers with ruthless efficiency, selling lands, titles, and offices. It is said that he even declared he would sell London if he found a buyer. In 1190, he departed for the Holy Land, an epic journey that would take him across Europe, Sicily, and Cyprus. In Cyprus, Richard conquered the island with astonishing ease, taking advantage of its strategic position to supply his army and secure a crucial base for the Crusades. It was during this period that his reputation as an indomitable warrior began to solidify. His arrival in the Holy Land revitalized the spirits of the Crusaders. Unlike other leaders, Richard immersed himself in combat, participating directly in battles and demonstrating a military prowess that earned him the nickname Lionheart. The Siege of Acre, 1191, was a milestone, followed by the controversial and brutal massacre of 2,700 Muslim prisoners, an act that, though common in medieval warfare, tarnished his image. The Battle of Arsuf, 1191, was his greatest military triumph. There, Richard, at the head of his knights, led a devastating charge against Saladin's forces, inflicting a decisive defeat on the Ayyubid Sultan. However, despite his victories, Richard failed to retake Jerusalem. Aware that he could not hold it if he conquered it, he negotiated a truce with Saladin in 1192, guaranteeing Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City. Richard's return journey was as dramatic as his campaigns. He was shipwrecked in the Adriatic and, attempting to cross Europe incognito, was captured by his enemy, Leopold V, Duke of Austria, whom he had offended during the Crusade. Leopold handed him over to Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, who held him prisoner and demanded an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks of silver, a colossal sum representing twice England's annual income. While Richard languished in captivity, his younger brother John and King Philip II, Augustus of France, conspired to usurp his throne and possessions. The loyalty of his English subjects, however, remained firm. Through a monumental fundraising effort, unprecedented taxes, sale of goods, etc., the ransom was paid, and Richard was released in 1194. Upon his return, Richard wasted no time. He forgave his brother John and launched into an relentless war against Philip II of France, his former Crusader ally, and now his archenemy. The last 5 years of his life were spent in constant warfare for his French domains. He fortified castles like the imposing Château Gaillard in Normandy, a masterpiece of military engineering, and led his troops with the same ferocity as ever. The end of Richard the Lionheart did not come in a great battle, but in a minor siege. In March 1199, Richard was besieging Châlus-Chabrol Castle in Limousin, searching for an alleged treasure. A crossbowman from the walls shot an arrow that wounded him in the shoulder. The wound, superficial at first, quickly gangrened due to lack of hygiene and the precariousness of medieval medicine. Aware of his imminent death, Richard forgave the crossbowman who had shot him, an act of magnanimity that contrasts with the Acre massacre, and died on April 6, 1199, at 41 years of age. Richard the Lionheart's life, though not as short as Alexander's, was equally brief in his reign, only 10 years, and was marked by unparalleled intensity. He spent only a few months of his reign in England, dedicating most of his time to war, whether in crusades, in captivity, or defending his French possessions. His legacy is that of an exceptional military leader, a symbol of chivalry and Christian heroism, but also that of an absent king who drained his kingdom for his military ambitions. His life, a whirlwind of battles, sieges, and sacrifices, is a vibrant testament to the warrior spirit that often defined medieval royalty, where glory was sought with the sword and life was a constant gamble against death and legend. Let us delve into the life of a king who barely had time to sit on the throne before death claimed him. A monarch whose existence, though brief, was marked by intrigues, premature responsibilities, and a series of decisions that perhaps sealed his fate. We speak of Louis of France, known as the Obstinate or the Quarreler. Born in Paris in 1289, Louis died in 1316 at the young age of 26, leaving behind a kingdom in turmoil and an unprecedented succession crisis. Louis was born into the cradle of French royalty as the firstborn of Philip IV, the Fair, and Joan of Navarre. His father, Philip IV, was an imposing and feared figure, nicknamed the Iron King, for his relentless will, his centralization of power, and his conflict with the papacy and the Order of the Knights Templar. Growing up in the shadow of such a dominant father was not easy. Louis was educated to reign, yes, but always under Philip's watchful and controlling eye. From a young age, Louis showed an impetuous and sometimes impulsive character, which earned him the nickname the Obstinate or the Quarreler. Unlike his father, who was calculating and cold, Louis could be temperamental. In 1305, at the age of 16, he married Margaret of Burgundy, a woman whose reputation would be stained by one of the greatest sexual scandals of the French court, the so-called Tour de Nesle affair. Margaret and her sisters-in-law were accused of adultery, which led to brutal imprisonment and Margaret's subsequent death in prison in 1315, an event that would have serious repercussions on the legitimacy of the heir and dynastic stability. As he grew older, Louis took on some responsibilities, mainly in Navarre, which was also part of his maternal inheritance. However, he remained a secondary figure compared to his father's omnipresence. No one expected him to ascend to the throne so soon. The sudden death of Philip V in November 1314, at the age of 46, catapulted Louis to the throne of France and Navarre. He was 25 years old, and although he inherited a vast and relatively consolidated kingdom, he also received an inheritance laden with problems and resentments accumulated by his father's authoritarian and fiscally demanding policies. The first great challenge for Louis X was the noble reaction. During Philip IV's reign, the nobility had seen their privileges and autonomies diminished. With a young and less experienced king in power, provincial noble leagues rose in protest, demanding the re-establishment of their ancient liberties and charters. Louis was forced to concede and issue a series of charters of liberties that partially dismantled some of his father's centralizing policies. This act of weakness or pragmatism, depending on how one views it, set a dangerous precedent for royal power. Another urgent matter was the situation of his wife, Margaret. He needed a valid marriage to ensure the succession. Margaret's death in prison, under unclear circumstances, it is speculated that she may have been strangled on Louis's orders to annul the marriage and allow him to remarry, enabled him to quickly marry Clemence of Hungary in 1315. This second marriage was crucial for the dynasty's stability, but the greatest challenge of his brief reign was the economy and hunger. France, and much of Europe, was on the eve of the Great Famine of 1315 into 1317, a catastrophe we have already explored. Harvests failed catastrophically due to years of excessive rain and unusual cold. Grain prices skyrocketed, people died of starvation in the streets, and food riots were common. Louis, unlike his father, did not possess the firmness or capacity of his predecessor to manage a crisis of such magnitude. His attempts to intervene in the economy, such as price fixing, were ineffective and often counterproductive, as the currency devalued and trade came to a halt. Popular discontent was palpable and dangerous. In addition to the economic crisis and hunger, Louis embarked on an unfortunate military campaign in Flanders in 1315, seeking to consolidate French control over the region. However, constant rain and adverse weather conditions turned the terrain into an impassable quagmire. The French army, poorly supplied and decimated by dysentery and exhaustion, suffered a humiliating failure without even fighting a decisive battle. This military defeat was a blow to the already faltering royal authority. Louis X's life, already marked by the stress of such a complicated reign, came to an abrupt end. In June 1316, after a game of jeu de paume, a precursor to tennis, which left him exhausted, Louis refreshed himself by drinking large quantities of iced wine. This act, imprudent for the medicine of the time and possibly for his already weakened organism, is believed to have caused pneumonia, pleurisy, or fatal indigestion. He died on June 5, 1316, at only 26 years old. His death was an unprecedented dynastic disaster for the French monarchy. Louis X left only one daughter from his first marriage, Joan, and his second wife, Clemence, was pregnant. The question of succession became a state crisis. Could a woman inherit the throne of France? French tradition was unclear on the matter. Finally, Louis's brother, Philip, assumed the regency, and when Clemence gave birth to a male, John I, the posthumous, the joy was immense. However, the child king lived only 5 days, dying in November 1316. With John's death, the application of Salic law, an ancient Germanic law that excluded women from the succession to the French throne, was consolidated. This led to Philip being crowned as Philip V. The short life and even shorter reign of Louis X are an eloquent testament to the fragility of medieval existence, even for kings. Pressed by the shadow of his powerful father, by court intrigues, by the hunger that ravaged his people, and by his own impulsive decisions, Louis was a monarch who quickly consumed himself on a throne that, though coveted, was also a trap of responsibilities and dangers. His premature death not only cut short a young life, but also unleashed a succession crisis that would mark the beginning of the end of the direct Capetian line, and would, eventually, be one of the causes of the 100 Years' War. We have traveled a somber and revealing path, a journey through an era where existence was, for the vast majority, a daily battle for survival. If we recapitulate every aspect of medieval life, from the precarious miracle of birth to the exhausting transition to a brief adulthood, was a constant test against death. We saw how childhood was a killing field, where half of the children did not reach adulthood. We analyzed how chronic hunger and devastating plagues like the Black Death decimated entire populations. We delved into the brutality of war and the daily violence of a justice that knew no mercy. And finally, we explored a medicine more akin to torture and an understanding of mental health that turned suffering into stigma. It is easy, from our comfortable modern perspective, to look back with horror and compassion. But what is truly astonishing about the Middle Ages is human resilience. Despite all these challenges, despite the certainty of a short and difficult life, people persisted, adapted, innovated on a small scale, built, loved, believed, and kept the flame of civilization alive. They founded cities that we still admire today, created works of art that inspire us, and laid the foundations for future advances. Their ability to carry on in the face of such adversity is, in itself, a monumental testament to the tenacity of the human spirit. The low life expectancy in the Middle Ages is not just a cold statistic, it is the most eloquent testimony to the harshness of an era. It forces us to reflect and to value, with deep gratitude, the advances in hygiene, nutrition, safety, and medicine that we now take for granted. Every vaccine, every antibiotic, every medical treatment, every workplace safety standard, every supermarket full of food is a colossal achievement that has radically transformed our relationship with life and death. So the next time you enjoy a warm meal, clean tap water, or the security of knowing that an illness won't be a death sentence, pause for a moment. Remember the high price paid by those who came before us. And with this reflection, we close this dark chapter of Silent of History. I hope this journey through the realities of medieval life has been as fascinating as it is unsettling. I would love to read your comments and know what other aspects of history you would like us to explore in future night stories. If you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to not miss any of our next installments. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the darkest corners of the past.